Listen closely. Can you hear it? Just on the edge of hearing. A sound that seems to drift across centuries, the soft, dry rustle of wheat swaying in a warm Mediterranean breeze, the faint, rhythmic cadence of a whispered chant, voices hushed in reverence and fear. This isn't just a sound from the past, it's an invitation, a keyhole through which we can peer into one of history's most profound and dangerous secrets. For nearly 2,000 years, this sound was the beginning of a transformation, a journey into the heart of an ancient mystery so powerful, so sacred, that to speak of it openly meant certain death. This is the world we are stepping into today, a world ruled by a goddess whose power was felt in every stalk of grain and every beat of the human heart, Demeter. As the Olympian goddess of the harvest, Demeter was far more than a mythological figure to the ancient Greeks. She was the very embodiment of life, death, and the fragile hope of rebirth. Her domain was the fertile soil that fed nations and the cyclical nature of existence itself. But behind the public festivals and prayers lay something deeper, something hidden from the eyes of the uninitiated. The most powerful expression of her worship was not in grand temples under the open sky, but in the profound secrecy of the Eleusinian Mysteries. This was not a religion for the masses. It was an exclusive, transformative experience that promised its participants a revelation about the meaning of life and what lies beyond death. The promise was so immense that thousands, from common farmers to emperors and philosophers like Plato and Cicero, willingly underwent a demanding initiation, binding themselves to an oath of silence that they would carry to their graves. The penalty for breaking that oath was severe and unequivocal execution. This was not an empty threat. History records the fate of those who dared to whisper the secrets they had witnessed. This stark reality forces us to ask a compelling question. What could possibly be so powerful, so earth-shattering, that an entire civilization agreed to keep it hidden for generations, protecting it with the ultimate price? What profound truth or terrifying vision was experienced in the dark halls of Eleusis that had to remain a whisper, never a shout? Our journey together is to unravel this enigma. We will sift through the fragments of history, archaeology, and ancient texts to reconstruct the shadowy outline of these ancient rituals of Demeter. We will explore why they held such immense power over the ancient world and confront the chilling silence that surrounds them even now. This is a story of faith, fear, and the human longing to understand the great mysteries of our existence. So let's begin where all great secrets start, in the shadows, just before the first whisper is heard. To truly grasp the immense power of the Eleusinian Mysteries, we must first understand the goddess at their very center. Demeter was not a distant, indifferent Olympian. Her power was immediate, tangible, and terrifyingly personal. Every single person in the ancient Greek world, from the lowliest farmhand to the emperor in his palace, depended on her goodwill for their most basic survival. When Demeter was happy, the sun shone, the rains came, and the earth produced a bounty that could feed families and fuel empires. But when she was grieved or angered, the very source of life could wither and die. This made her one of the most potent and feared figures in the entire pantheon, a deity whose emotional state was a matter of public safety. Her story, the core myth that underpinned all her worship, explains this perfectly. It is the tale of Demeter and her daughter Persephone. One day, while Persephone was gathering flowers, the earth split open, and Hades, god of the underworld, emerged to abduct her to be his queen in the land of the dead. Demeter's grief was apocalyptic. She abandoned her divine duties on Mount Olympus and wandered the earth in the guise of an old woman, and in her profound sorrow, she caused a great famine to fall upon the world. No crops would grow, no plants would flower, humanity faced utter extinction. This story reveals Demeter's dual nature in the starkest terms. She is the ultimate nurturing mother, fiercely protective of her child, yet in her grief, she becomes the architect of universal suffering. She demonstrates that the power to give life is intrinsically linked to the power to take it away. This profound duality is captured in her ancient symbols. The most obvious, of course, is the sheaf of wheat, representing the gift of agriculture and the sustenance she provides. But look closer. She is almost always shown holding torches, not just one, but often two. These are not for illumination in a simple sense. They represent her desperate, relentless search for Persephone through the darkness of her despair. The torchlight signifies a quest for truth in the shadows, a theme central to the mysteries themselves. Then there is the serpent, a creature that sheds its skin, symbolizing rebirth and the cyclical nature of life and death, a constant reminder of the journey to the underworld and back. And perhaps most intriguingly, her sacred animal was the pig. This might seem strange, but the pig was a creature of both fertility, known for its large litters, and of the underworld, often used in sacrifices to chthonic or earth deities. The pig's sacrifice during the Eleusinian rites symbolized a descent into death and the hope of emerging renewed, so Demeter was far more than a simple harvest goddess. She was the embodiment of the entire cycle, life, death, and the fragile, desperate hope for rebirth. Her story was humanity's story. They saw their own lives reflected in her joy and her sorrow, in the abundant summers and the barren winters. This is why the rituals dedicated to her were so profound. They weren't just asking for a good harvest, they were seeking answers to the most fundamental human questions. What happens to us after we die? Is there meaning in our suffering? Can we, like Persephone, find a way to return from the darkness? The initiates who entered her sanctuary at Eleusis weren't just worshipping a deity of grain. They were seeking an audience with the goddess who held the keys to existence itself. And it was in the coastal town of Eleusis, just a short journey west from the bustling heart of Athens, that this profound connection between goddess and humanity found its ultimate expression. For close to 2,000 years, this specific location was the epicenter of a religious phenomenon unlike any other in the ancient world. Imagine an institution so powerful, so compelling, that it operated continuously from a time before the Parthenon was even a blueprint, surviving through the rise and fall of empires, through wars and plagues, right up until the end of the 4th century, when a Roman emperor finally ordered its closure. That is the staggering timescale of the Eleusinian Mysteries. To put that longevity into perspective, if the mysteries were starting today, they would have begun around the time of the Roman Empire's founding, and only now, in our modern era, would they be coming to an end. This wasn't a fleeting cult, it was a cornerstone of ancient spiritual life. Each year, as the late summer heat began to soften, a palpable sense of anticipation would ripple across the Greek world. The call would go out and a great pilgrimage would begin. Thousands upon thousands of people from every corner of the Mediterranean would make their way to Athens. They weren't just locals, this was an international event. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a world fair, but one centered entirely on a spiritual quest. Initiates and would-be initiates, from powerful politicians and famous playwrights to simple farmers and merchants, all traveled with a shared purpose. Upon reaching Athens, they would gather at the sacred spring of Kallichoros to begin a solemn 15-mile procession on foot along the sacred way, the road leading to Eleusis itself. The journey itself was a critical part of the ritual. It was a physical and mental preparation, a slow stripping away of the concerns of everyday life. They walked together, a river of humanity flowing towards the epicenter of the mystery. Along the way, they would pass sacred sites and shrines, each one a marker on the path to transformation. The atmosphere would have been electric, a mix of solemn reverence, hushed excitement, and perhaps a touch of nervous fear. What awaited them at the end of this road was a secret so potent that speaking of it was forbidden on pain of death. This collective journey created a powerful sense of community among the participants, a bond forged by shared anticipation and the weight of the oath they were about to take. They were leaving the profane world behind and stepping toward the sacred, moving from the known into the unknown, all drawn by the promise of a revelation that would change their understanding of life and death forever. This single event, the splitting of the earth, set in motion a chain of events that would define the very rhythm of life and death for the ancient world. The abduction was swift and absolute. One moment, Persephone was a carefree maiden, a symbol of springtime innocence, and the next she was plunged into the silent, sunless realm of the dead. For Demeter, the mother, the loss was instantaneous and cataclysmic. A parent's worst nightmare made divine reality. She did not simply mourn, her grief became a physical force that reshaped the world. She heard her daughter's fading cry echo across the land and sea, and she tore the divine headdress from her hair, casting aside her dignity in her anguish. She abandoned her throne on Mount Olympus and began a desperate, relentless search that would last 9 days and 9 nights. During this time, she wandered the earth, a solitary and tragic figure. She carried with her 2 torches kindled from the fires of Mount Etna, and their light became a symbol of her unwavering determination to find the truth in the overwhelming darkness of her despair. She neither ate nor drank nor bathed, her entire being consumed by the quest for her lost child. She asked everyone she met, gods, nymphs, even mortals, if they had seen her daughter, but no one dared to speak the truth for fear of Hades' wrath. It was the sun god, Helios, who finally revealed the terrible secret. He, who sees all from his chariot in the sky, told Demeter that Zeus himself had given his silent consent for the abduction, a political arrangement between brothers that had utterly disregarded a mother's love. This betrayal ignited a different, far more dangerous emotion within Demeter, a cold, calculated wrath. Her sorrow had already cast a pall over the world, but her anger would now unleash its full fury. In her divine rage, she disguised herself as an old mortal woman named Doso and withdrew her life-giving power from the earth. She caused a great famine to descend upon the land. The soil became hard as iron, refusing to yield. Seeds rotted in the ground, trees bore no fruit, and livestock died in the fields. Humanity, which had played no part in this divine treachery, began to suffer and starve. The gods on Olympus, who relied on the smoke of sacrifices from a thriving human population, found their own altars growing cold and silent. Demeter's protest was not a plea, it was a strike. She demonstrated in the most visceral way possible that the power of life is not a given, it is a gift that can be withdrawn. The world experienced its first winter not of snow and ice but of absolute barrenness, a direct reflection of a mother's broken heart. Faced with the potential extinction of the human race and the collapse of their own worship, the gods were forced to intervene. Zeus sent messenger after messenger to plead with Demeter, but she was immovable. She declared that she would not restore life to the earth until she set eyes upon her daughter once more. Finally, Zeus had no choice but to command Hades to release Persephone. But here, the myth introduces its most famous and poignant twist, the detail that explains everything. As Persephone was preparing to leave the underworld, Hades, knowing he was bound by his brother's command, offered her a simple, seemingly innocent gift, a single pomegranate seed. In her hunger, and perhaps with a touch of compassion for her captor-turned husband, Persephone ate it. This single act had monumental consequences. In the ancient understanding of hospitality and obligation, to partake of food in another's domain was to create an unbreakable bond. By consuming the food of the dead, Persephone had tied a part of herself to the underworld forever. She could not leave completely. A compromise brokered by the wise goddess Hecate was struck. Because Persephone had eaten only one seed, she would be required to spend only 1/3 of the year, the winter months, as queen of the underworld with Hades. For the remaining 2/3, she could return to the world above, to the joyous embrace of her mother. This is the resolution that gave the ancient world its most fundamental rhythm. When Persephone ascends each spring, Demeter's joy causes the earth to erupt in blossoms and new growth. the world is reborn in a celebration of reunion. The summer months are a time of abundance, of Demeter's full and generous power. But as autumn wanes and the time comes for Persephone to descend once more, Demeter's grief returns. The plants wither, the trees become bare, and the world enters a period of mourning and dormancy, awaiting the inevitable cycle of return. The story is not just an explanation for the seasons, it is a profound allegory for the human experience of loss, grief, and the fragile, persistent hope of renewal. It taught that death is not an end but a part of a cycle, and that even in the deepest darkness the promise of light and life remains. This core truth, this emotional journey from despair to conditional joy, was the very essence of what the initiates at Eleusis sought to experience for themselves. The journey itself was the first and perhaps most crucial stage of the initiation. After days of preparation and purification in Athens, the vast crowd of mysti or initiates would assemble before dawn. The air would be thick with a mixture of solemnity and barely contained anticipation. Led by the sacred heralds and priests, they would begin their march along the sacred way, the well-trodden path that connected the political heart of Athens to the spiritual epicenter at Eleusis. This was not a casual stroll. It was a deliberate 15-mile procession that served as a powerful physical metaphor for the transition from the profane world to the sacred. With each step away from the city's noise and politics, they were symbolically shedding their everyday identities, moving closer to the mystery that awaited. Participation in this profound experience was not open to all. The barriers to entry were specific and significant. Firstly, one had to be a free person. Slaves were excluded from this promise of a blessed afterlife. Secondly, you had to be able to understand Greek, as the rituals and chants were performed in the language, ensuring the sacred words were comprehended. Most intriguingly, anyone who had committed murder and had not been ritually purified for it was strictly forbidden. This rule underscores the mystery's core theme. They were about spiritual purity and confronting the cycle of life and death, not escaping the consequences of unjust actions. The requirement paints a picture of a community seeking collective cleansing, united by a shared desire for redemption and understanding, not merely curiosity. As the procession moved westward, it was far from a silent march. The initiates carried sacred objects in special baskets, and they engaged in a unique form of worship known as Jepharismoi. The ritual insults and jesting shouted as they crossed a bridge over the river Kephizos. Scholars believe this seemingly rude behavior served a vital purpose, to ward off evil spirits that might be lurking at the threshold between the ordinary world and the sacred precinct. It was a moment of controlled chaos, a cathartic release of tension that strengthened the bonds between the participants through shared, sanctioned mockery. This was followed by periods of chanting and the rhythmic swinging of branches called bakoi, creating a mesmerizing, collective rhythm that further united the crowd. The physical hardship of the journey cannot be overstated. Walking 15 miles in the late summer heat, likely in simple sandals and without modern comforts, was a test of dedication. This shared exertion fostered an incredible sense of communal bonding. Imagine the conversations, the shared silence, the helping hand offered to a fellow initiate struggling with the distance. They were all equals on this road, from the famous philosopher to the humble potter, united by a common goal. They stopped at designated shrines along the way, offering prayers and hearing myths associated with the landscape, each site layering another level of symbolic meaning onto their pilgrimage. By the time the massive, fortified walls of the sanctuary of Demeter and Kore came into view, the initiates were no longer a random collection of individuals. They were a purified community, physically weary but spiritually primed, ready to cross the final threshold and receive the secrets they had traveled so far to find. Arriving at the coastal sanctuary after the long, dusty trek from Athens was a moment of profound transition. The massive stone walls of the sacred precinct loomed ahead, but before any initiate could set foot inside, they had to undergo a final, essential act of cleansing. The journey was not complete until they had confronted the sea. The initiates, still carrying their sacred baskets, would make their way to the shoreline, where the rhythmic crash of the waves served as a natural call to purification. This was not a simple bath. It was a meticulously choreographed ritual, the first major act upon reaching Eleusis and a necessary step to wash away the last vestiges of the outside world. Central to this ritual was a seemingly humble creature, the piglet. Each initiate or each family group would have brought a young pig with them, carried along the sacred way for this very purpose. The choice of animal was deeply symbolic. Pigs were creatures of dual nature. On one hand, they were potent symbols of fertility, known for their large litters and connection to the earth's abundance. On the other hand, they were strongly associated with chthonic or underworld forces. Pigs were often used in sacrifices to deities of the earth and the dead, and their squealing was thought to placate the spirits of the underworld. By bringing a piglet to the sea, the initiates were symbolically bringing their own connection to the cycles of life, death, and decay to be cleansed and transformed. The act itself was powerfully physical. The participants would wade into the cold salt water, holding the squirming, protesting piglet. They would immerse the animal, washing it in the waves, and then wash themselves. The Mediterranean Sea was not just water, it was seen as a primordial, purifying force. The salt was believed to have apotropaic qualities, the power to drive away malevolent influences. As the water washed over their skin and the animal, it was understood to be scrubbing away not just physical dirt but spiritual contamination, the worries, sins, and impurities accumulated from daily life. This was a baptism of sorts, a rebirth into a state of ritual purity required to approach the goddesses. The sacrifice of the piglet, which would follow later, was prefigured in this washing. By cleansing the animal, the initiate was preparing it as a worthy offering, but they were also symbolically cleansing the part of themselves that the pig represented, their own mortality, their connection to the earth and the underworld. They were washing away fear and impurity, preparing to stand before Demeter and Persephone not as flawed individuals, but as purified seekers ready to receive the ultimate revelation. The sound of the waves, the feel of the cold water, the struggle of the animal all combined to create a visceral, unforgettable experience that marked the final, irrevocable step across the threshold from the mundane to the sacred. With their bodies cleansed by the sea and their spirits prepared by the long pilgrimage, the initiates now faced a final, intimate trial, a day of complete fasting. This was not merely a physical act of denial, it was a profound act of empathy, a deliberate reenactment of the goddess's own suffering. For 24 hours they would consume nothing, no food, no drink. They were stepping into Demeter's shoes, experiencing a small fraction of the all-consuming grief that led her to refuse ambrosia and nectar on Mount Olympus. As hunger pangs turned into a dull, constant ache and thirst parched their throats, their own physical discomfort became a direct connection to the divine narrative. They weren't just hearing a story about a goddess's sorrow, they were, in a very real sense, embodying it. This shared hunger united them further, stripping away another layer of their individual identities and merging their collective experience into a single, focused state of anticipation and vulnerability. The fast was a gateway, a necessary emptiness that had to be created before it could be filled with something extraordinary. The breaking of this fast was as significant as the fast itself, and it came not with a feast of roasted meats and fine wine, but with a single, humble drink, the kykeon. This was a simple potion, a mixture of barley groats water and a sprinkling of pennyroyal mint. On the surface, it seemed almost disappointingly plain, a peasant's meal. But in the context of the mysteries, every ingredient was charged with profound symbolic meaning. The barley was the direct gift of Demeter, the grain she had taught humanity to cultivate. The pennyroyal mint was an herb known to the ancients for its ability to soothe the stomach, a practical consideration after a day of fasting, but also a nod to the gentle, restorative power of the goddess. By consuming this simple concoction, the initiates were, in a sense, partaking of Demeter's own essence, sharing in the first sustenance she might have accepted after her period of mourning. It was a communion, a physical ingestion of the myth that bound them to the goddess. Yet, the true nature of the kykeon has become one of the most heated debates in the study of the Eleusinian Mysteries. Could this simple drink have been something more? Could it have been the very engine of the transcendent visions that initiates reported? A compelling theory, most famously proposed by scholars like Gordon Wasson, Albert Hoffman, and Karl Ruck, suggests that the barley used to make the kykeon could have been purposefully contaminated with ergot, a fungus that naturally grows on cereal grains. Ergot is the source molecule for lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD. When processed correctly, this ergot-infested barley could have produced a potent psychoactive brew. The effects of such a substance would align strikingly with the descriptions of the mystery's climax: vivid, life-altering visual and auditory hallucinations, a profound sense of unity with the divine, and an overwhelming conviction about the benevolence of the afterlife. This theory offers a tantalizingly logical explanation for the powerful and consistent experiences reported across generations of initiates. It suggests that the priests of Eleusis, through centuries of careful observation, may have mastered a form of sacred pharmacology, using a naturally occurring substance to reliably induce a mystical state. The ritual would then have been a carefully controlled set and setting: the fasting, the procession, the darkness, the chanting, all designed to guide the psychedelic experience toward a specific, spiritually meaningful conclusion centered on the myth of Demeter and Persephone. The revelation, the epopteia, would not have been a theatrical trick, but an interior, psychological voyage catalyzed by a chemical key. However, we must also consider the powerful counter-argument that the experience was purely psychological, driven by expectation, sensory deprivation, and the immense emotional and spiritual weight of the rituals. The fasting alone can induce altered states of consciousness through hypoglycemia. The days of chanting, the exhaustion of the journey, the terror and excitement of entering the dark Telesterion, all of these factors could have combined to create a state of heightened suggestibility where visions felt utterly real. Perhaps the kykeon was indeed just a symbolic meal, and the true magic was woven from the potent combination of belief, ritual, and human vulnerability. This debate may never be fully settled, but whether the key was chemical or deeply psychological, the outcome was the same. Thousands of people emerged from the sanctuary convinced they had glimpsed the ultimate truth, their fear of death extinguished by an experience so powerful it defied words and demanded silence. The fast created the void, and the kykeon, in its own mysterious way, filled it with light. But before any initiate could even set foot on the sacred way for that great autumn procession, they had to be deemed worthy. The profound experience at Eleusis was not an impulsive decision. It was a meticulously structured, year-long spiritual journey that began not with the grand spectacle, but with a quieter, equally essential ritual held months earlier. This was the gateway, the necessary first step known as the Lesser Mysteries. Imagine it as a prerequisite, a sacred boot camp for the soul that prepared the candidate for the overwhelming intensity of what was to come. Held each year in the early spring during the month of Telesterion, which corresponds roughly to our February or March, the Lesser Mysteries took place not in the secluded sanctuary of Eleusis, but right in the heart of Athens. The location itself is significant. While Eleusis was a place set apart, dedicated solely to the secret rites, Athens was the bustling, public center of Greek life. Holding the preliminary rituals here made them more accessible, allowing a broader pool of candidates to begin their spiritual journey. The ceremonies were centered around the banks of the Elaisos River, a waterway that flowed just outside the city walls, providing the fresh, flowing water necessary for the primary activity of the event, purification. The core purpose of the Lesser Mysteries was catharsis, a deep, ritual cleansing. This wasn't just about washing off physical dirt, it was about scrubbing the soul, preparing the individual to be a clean vessel ready to receive the profound secrets of the greater mysteries. The rituals here were believed to purify participants from any major spiritual stains, particularly the miasma or pollution associated with bloodshed. This is why those who had committed murder but had undergone legal purification were often required to start here, to ensure they were truly fit to approach the goddesses. While the details are shrouded in the same oath-bound secrecy, scholars believe the rites of the Lesser Mysteries were closely tied to the story of the hero Heracles. According to myth, Heracles, a foreigner and someone who had committed many acts of violence, was barred from initiation into the Eleusinian Mysteries because of the pollution surrounding him. To cleanse himself and become eligible, he was instructed to undergo a special purification ritual, which became the prototype for the Lesser Mysteries. By reenacting elements of this myth, candidates were symbolically following in the footsteps of the great hero, undergoing their own transformation from a state of impurity to one of readiness. A central part of this purification involved sacrifices and likely a ritual bath in the Elyssos River. The flowing water was seen as carrying away impurities, much like the sea would later do at Eleusis, but this was a more formal initial cleansing. It's also highly probable that during these spring rites, candidates received their first formal instructions. They would have learned the basic sacred stories, the hymns to be chanted, and the strict behavioral codes they would need to follow. Most importantly, this was likely the moment they took their first oath of secrecy, swearing not to reveal anything they were about to see or hear. This oath was a binding contract, and breaking it carried the death penalty, a stark reminder of the seriousness of the path they had chosen. By successfully completing the Lesser Mysteries, a candidate was no longer an outsider. They earned the title of Mysts, meaning one who has been initiated, but only at the first level. They were now part of the inner circle, prepared and sanctified, but they had not yet witnessed the ultimate secret. The Lesser Mysteries gave them the spiritual tools and the purified state of being necessary to withstand and fully comprehend the epopteia, the final revelation, that awaited them in the dark hall of the Telesterion 6 months later. It was a crucial filtering process, ensuring that only those with genuine dedication and the right spiritual disposition would proceed to the main event. This two-stage system highlights the incredible sophistication of the Eleusinian program. It wasn't a single ritual, but a carefully orchestrated journey of transformation, beginning with the symbolic rebirth of spring and culminating in the face of death itself each autumn. This brings us to the very epicenter of the mystery, the architectural marvel where the ancient world's most profound secret was revealed. After days of preparation and purification, the initiates would finally approach their ultimate destination, the Telesterion. This was not a temple in the traditional sense, with a grand facade designed to inspire awe from the outside. Quite the opposite, the Telesterion was a massive, windowless, almost fortress-like hall. A stark, rectangular building constructed not for beauty, but for a singular, powerful function, to contain darkness and secrecy. Its imposing, unadorned walls were a physical promise that what happened inside would remain inside. The scale of this structure was truly breathtaking. Rebuilt and enlarged over centuries, the final Telesterion at its peak could hold an estimated 3,000 people or more at one time. To stand before it would have been an intimidating experience. There were no grand columns like those of the Parthenon, no ornate sculptures visible to the public. It was a sealed box, a sacred container. The only light for the nocturnal ceremony would have come from the torches carried by the priests and perhaps from a great central hearth, their flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows that would only deepen the sense of mystery and anticipation. The air inside, thick with the smell of smoke, sweat, and the earthy scent of thousands of bodies, would have been heavy with expectation. Upon entering, the initiates would have encountered an interior layout unlike any other building in the ancient world. Instead of rows of seats facing a stage, the Telesterion's floor was surrounded by 8 tiers of steep, narrow steps carved from stone, rising like bleachers on all 4 sides of the vast hall. This design is critically important. It suggests that the participants were not passive spectators sitting quietly in the dark. They stood or perhaps even moved on these steps. This arrangement would have allowed everyone a view of the central floor, but it also created a sense of being surrounded, enveloped by the community of fellow initiates. The acoustics in such a space would have been extraordinary. A whisper from the center could ripple outwards, and the collective sound of chanting or gasping would resonate through the stone, vibrating through the very bodies of the participants, making the experience intensely physical and communal. And at the very heart of this great hall lay the most sacred spot of all, the Anaktoron. This was the Holy of Holies, a small, permanent stone structure built right into the floor of the Telesterion. It was not a room one could enter. It was more like a sacred closet or a shrine, sealed off from direct contact. This was where the most sacred objects of the mysteries, the Hira, were stored when not in use. What these objects were is the deepest secret of Eleusis, lost to history because of the inviolable oath of silence. Scholars have speculated for centuries. Were they ancient aniconic stones worshipped before the time of the Olympian gods? Perhaps they were relics tied directly to the myth of Demeter and Persephone, a sheaf of wheat from the first harvest, the torches the goddess carried in her search, or even a symbolic representation of the pomegranate. Whatever they were, their power was not in their appearance but in their meaning. They were the physical anchors of the myth, the tangible proof of the goddess's presence and her promise. The entire ritual was likely choreographed around this central point. The head priests, the Hierophant, and his attendants would have descended to the Anaktoron at the climax of the ceremony. The act of unveiling these sacred objects, of bringing them out from their sealed repository into the view of the assembled initiates, was the moment of epopteia, the final, shocking revelation. In that absolute darkness, broken only by the sudden, dramatic light of torches focused on the Hira, thousands of people would have witnessed the sacred proof of the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. The Telesterion, with its stepped sides focusing all attention inward and its windowless walls guarding the secret, was the perfect machine for generating a collective, transformative experience. It was a crucible where individual fear was melted away in the heat of a shared, overwhelming vision. Then came the night, the heart of the mystery. The great doors of the Telesterion were sealed, plunging the 3,000 or more initiates into an absolute, suffocating darkness. This was no mere absence of light. It was a deliberate, engineered void, a sensory deprivation that stripped away all anchors to the outside world. In that profound blackness, every sound would have been magnified, every whisper echoing off the stone steps, every nervous breath of the person beside you feeling like your own. This was the canvas upon which the most powerful experience of their lives would be painted. We will never know the exact sequence of events, for the oath of silence was terrifyingly effective, but by piecing together hints from ancient writers who were initiates themselves, like the playwright Sophocles, who spoke of being blessed by the goddesses, or the orator Cicero, who claimed the rites taught humanity how to live with joy and die with better hope, we can reconstruct a shadow outline of what likely unfolded. The ceremony was almost certainly not a passive spectacle. It was a meticulously orchestrated, multi-sensory assault designed to evoke the full emotional arc of the Demeter and Persephone myth. Scholars believe it began with a sacred drama, a reenactment of the story performed by the priests in the central space. The initiates standing on the tiered steps surrounding the action would not have been mere spectators, they were participants in the collective emotion. The night would have been filled with sound. the haunting cry of a gong or a bronze sheet struck to mimic the earth splitting open for Hades' chariot, the frantic, grief-stricken calls of a priestess portraying Demeter searching for her lost daughter, and the terrified screams representing Persephone's abduction. This was not entertainment, it was a form of ritualized trauma, a guided descent into the darkest emotions of loss and despair, mirroring the goddess's own suffering. The emotional low point, the representation of Demeter's grief and the barrenness of the world, would have been palpable in the cold, dark hall. But this despair was the necessary prelude to the climax, the moment of epopteia or seeing. At the peak of the darkness and emotional turmoil, something miraculous would occur. A single door in the Anactoron, the small, sealed shrine at the center of the hall, was flung open. From within, the Hierophant, the high priest whose title literally means the one who shows the holy, would emerge, and in that instant a blinding, brilliant light would flood the Telesterion. This was not the flickering glow of a dozen torches. Ancient sources suggest it was an astonishingly powerful, concentrated flame, perhaps created by a sophisticated system of polished metal reflectors focusing the light from a great fire. After hours in total blackness, the sudden eruption of light would have been physically shocking, a visceral shock to the system that felt truly supernatural. It is at this moment that the Hierophant would reveal the Hiera, the most sacred objects of the cult. What these objects were remains the ultimate secret. Speculation ranges from ancient, aniconic stones worshipped before the time of the Olympian gods to relics tied directly to the myth. A sheaf of the first wheat, a replica of the pomegranate, or even the torches Demeter carried. Their power likely did not lie in their intrinsic value, but in their symbolic meaning, unveiled at the precise moment they represented the story's turning point. As the brilliant light illuminated the Hiera, the Hierophant would proclaim in a mighty voice the central truth of the mysteries. While the exact words are lost, their meaning is clear from the experiences reported by initiates. It was a declaration of hope, a revelation about the continuity of life. One later source, a Christian writer keen to disparage the rite, claimed the proclamation was, "The mistress has borne a sacred boy." Brimo has borne Brimos, which would signify a divine birth, a symbol of new life emerging from the underworld. Another interpretation is that the proclamation simply affirmed the core lesson. Rejoice, Mistai, the God is saved, and from the God you too shall have salvation. The climax was likely a fusion of these elements, the sacred drama, the shocking light, the revelation of the holy objects, and the triumphant proclamation. The effect would have been overwhelming. For the initiates who had fasted, journeyed, and shared in the collective sorrow, this was not a story about the gods anymore. It was their story. The journey from darkness to blinding light mirrored their own hoped-for journey from death to a blessed afterlife. The revelation was not an intellectual idea, it was a deeply felt physical and emotional certainty. They didn't just learn that life continues after death. In that hall, surrounded by their community and shattered by the sensory experience, they felt it, they knew it in their bones. This was the great secret that could not be spoken, not because it was a complex theological doctrine, but because it was an indescribable, transformative feeling of hope, a conviction that death was not an end, but a part of a sacred, renewing cycle. Now we stand at the precipice of the great secret itself, the moment of revelation. What was it that the Hierophant brought forth from the darkness of the Anactoron into that sudden, shocking blaze of light? What were the Hiera, the sacred objects, whose sight alone was promised to transform a mortal's understanding of eternity? The contents of that sacred chest, the kist, are the most fiercely guarded secret of Eleusis, and unlike the rituals, not even vague descriptions have survived. The oath of silence held firm here above all else. Yet, by examining the clues within the myth and the few tantalizing hints dropped by ancient writers, we can speculate on what might have possessed such earth-shattering power. One of the most enduring theories centers on the very essence of Demeter's gift, agriculture. It is powerfully compelling to imagine the Hierophant holding aloft a single, perfect stalk of wheat. In our modern world, this might seem simplistic, even anticlimactic, but to an ancient Greek for whom the success of the harvest was the difference between life and death, a stalk of wheat was not just a plant, it was a miracle. It was the ultimate symbol of the cycle the mysteries sought to explain, the seed that must be buried in the dark earth that appears to die, only to rise again into the sunlight, bearing the gift of life. To see this simple, profound object illuminated in the sacred darkness would have been to understand the divine pattern encoded in nature itself. The message would be clear: just as the grain returns, so too does the human soul. This theory aligns perfectly with the words of the later Christian writer Hippolytus, who, in his efforts to discredit the pagan rites, claimed that at the climax the Hierophant cried out, "The mistress has borne a sacred boy." Brimo has borne Brimos. This suggests a revelation involving a divine birth. Brimo, the Mighty One, is a title often associated with Persephone in her underworld aspect, and Brimos would be her divine child, symbolizing new life born from the realm of death. Another possibility points to objects directly from the mythic narrative. What if the kist contained the very tools of Demeter's grief and search? Imagine the impact of seeing the goddess's torches, the ones she lit from the fires of Mount Etna to scour the earth for her daughter. In the darkness of the Telesterion, these would not be mere props. They would be a tangible connection to her desperate journey, a symbol of the relentless search for truth in the face of despair. Even more potent would be the pomegranate itself. The fruit that bound Persephone to the underworld was also the key to her return. To display a pomegranate, perhaps split open to reveal its blood-red seeds, would be to show the initiates the very mechanism of the cycle, the token of death that contains within it the promise of life. It represented the bittersweet compromise that makes rebirth possible, teaching that our ties to the world of shadows are not merely chains, but also the reasons for our eventual return. Some scholars venture into even more ancient territory, suggesting the Hierophant may have been aniconic objects, sacred stones, or carved wooden idols that predated the Olympian gods themselves. These would have been relics of a time when deities were worshipped as powerful, impersonal forces within the landscape. Their immense age would have lent them an aura of primal, terrifying power, connecting the initiates to a tradition far older and more fundamental than the familiar stories of Zeus and Hera. Their simplicity would have been their strength, representing the raw, unadorned power of the life-death-rebirth cycle that Demeter herself embodied. But perhaps we are thinking about this in the wrong way. Maybe the true power of the Hierophant was not in their physical form at all, but in their context. The transformative moment, the epopteia, was likely not a simple showing. It was the culmination of an intense, days-long psychological and physical ordeal. The initiates were fasting, exhausted, emotionally wrought from the sacred drama, and plunged into total sensory deprivation. In that heightened state of vulnerability and expectation, any object revealed with dramatic suddenness in a burst of blinding light would have been seared into their consciousness with supernatural force. The sacred object acted as a focal point, a physical anchor for the overwhelming emotional and spiritual catharsis of the entire journey. It gave the ineffable experience a form, something concrete to latch onto in memory. The revelation was the entire sequence: the darkness, the despair, the light, the object, and the triumphant proclamation fusing together into a single, undeniable conviction. The initiates didn't just see a stalk of wheat, they saw the meaning of life and death. They didn't just see a pomegranate, they understood the contract between darkness and light. In that moment, the symbol and the truth it represented became one and the same. This is why the secret was so impossible to communicate. You could describe a stalk of wheat to someone, but you could never convey the life-altering certainty that flooded the soul of the initiate who witnessed it in the heart of the mystery. The Hyra were the key, but the lock was the human heart prepared by ritual and shattered open by revelation. And so, after what must have felt like an eternity in that absolute blackness, the moment arrived. Without warning, a sound would have shattered the silence, not a gentle chime, but the deafening, resonant crash of a great bronze gong, a sound so powerful it would vibrate in the chests of every person present. This was the signal. In the very next instant, the entire vast hall was flooded with a light so brilliant, so shocking, that it could only be described as supernatural. This was the great fire, the climactic vision that every initiate, from the humble farmer to the Roman emperor, consistently described as the heart of the revelation. After the prolonged sensory deprivation, the sudden blaze would have been physically painful, forcing eyes to shut and then slowly, incredulously, open again. It was not the warm, flickering glow of a hearth. Ancient sources suggest it was a stark, white, and concentrated flame, likely amplified by ingenious means. Historians speculate that the priests may have used a large, polished metal reflector, something like a massive parabolic mirror, to focus the light from a central fire into a single, blinding beam that swept across the terrified and awestruck faces of the 3,000 initiates. The effect was not just visual, it was a full-body experience. The heat of the fire would have washed over them, a stark contrast to the cool night air, and the roar of the flames would have mixed with the fading echo of the gong, creating an overwhelming sensory cascade. This dramatic eruption of light was the ultimate symbol, a divine metaphor made terrifyingly real. In the narrative of the sacred drama, it represented the precise moment of Persephone's return from the underworld. The darkness was her time in Hades, the grief of Demeter, the barrenness of winter. The great fire was the explosive joy of their reunion, the victory of life over death, the brilliant dawn that follows the longest night. For the agricultural society that worshipped Demeter, this was not an abstract idea. They lived this cycle every year. They knew the anxiety of watching the winter stores dwindle and the unparalleled relief and joy of seeing the first green shoots break through the thawing soil. The Great Fire was that feeling of salvation amplified to a cosmic scale. It was the promise that the sun would always return, that the seeds hidden in the earth would always find the strength to push upward toward the light. But the message was far deeper than the annual harvest. The initiates were being shown a pattern that applied directly to their own souls. The sequence of the ritual, the descent into darkness and despair followed by the shocking, glorious return of light, was a map of the human journey through life and into the afterlife. They were being taught that just as Persephone returns and just as the grain rises, so too would their own essence survive the darkness of the grave. The Great Fire was a preview of what lay beyond, not a cold, silent oblivion, but a realm of brilliant, welcoming light. This is why so many initiates, like the Roman orator Cicero, stated that the mysteries taught them how to live with joy and how to die with better hope. The vision of the fire provided a tangible anchor for that hope. It was a memory they could carry for the rest of their lives, a light they could recall in their own moments of fear or despair. The psychological impact of this carefully orchestrated climax cannot be overstated. Modern understanding of sensory perception helps explain its power. After an extended period in total darkness, the human retina becomes incredibly sensitive. The sudden exposure to such an intense light would have caused a temporary overstimulation, potentially inducing phosphenes, the perception of light without light actually entering the eye, and other visual phenomena that would have felt truly miraculous. The combination of this biological reaction with the profound emotional buildup, the fasting, the chanting, and the sacred storytelling created a perfect storm for a transcendent experience. The initiates weren't just seeing a fire, they were witnessing a divine miracle tailored by centuries of ritual refinement. It was the ultimate answer to the question that had drawn them to Eleusis. The darkness of death is not an end, but a necessary prelude to an awakening into a brilliant, eternal light. This was the secret that was impossible to utter because its power was not in a formula of words, but in the searing, unforgettable image of light conquering the deepest dark. This promise of a blessed afterlife stands in stark contrast to the bleak vision of the underworld that had haunted the Greek imagination for centuries. Before the rise of the mysteries, the dominant view of the afterlife came from the epic poetry of Homer. In his works, the realm of Hades is a joyless, shadowy place. The souls of the dead, mere wisps of their former selves called shades, flit about in a grey, featureless landscape. They have lost their strength, their memories, and their very identities. Achilles, the greatest of the Greek heroes, famously declares in the Odyssey that he would rather be a poor, landless laborer on earth than a king among the dead. This was the common fear, that death was not an end to suffering but a diminishment, a transition into a perpetual state of weakness and forgetfulness. It was a fate to be dreaded, a truth that cast a long shadow over the triumphs and tragedies of mortal life. The Eleusinian Mysteries offered a radical and comforting alternative. Instead of this gloomy, monotonous existence, initiates were promised a vibrant, joyful afterlife in a specific, blessed realm known as the Elysian Fields, or the Isles of the Blessed. This was not a land of shadows, but a paradise. Ancient descriptions paint a picture of a place where the air is always fresh, the grass is perpetually green, and the sun shines with a gentle, warm light. There is no toil, no sickness, and no sorrow. The blessed dead there enjoy a life of leisure and pleasure, engaging in the athletic and musical pursuits they loved in life, but free from any pain or effort. It was a restoration of existence at its most perfect, an eternal reward for a life well lived, and most importantly, for having been initiated into the sacred secrets of Demeter and Persephone. This belief was the primary engine behind the cult's immense and enduring popularity. For nearly 2,000 years, people from every stratum of society were drawn to Eleusis. What is truly remarkable is that this promise cut across all social and economic boundaries. A wealthy Athenian aristocrat like Alcibiades, a philosopher like Plato, a Roman emperor like Marcus Aurelius, and an anonymous Athenian potter or farmer all shared the same hope. In a world riven by class distinctions and political strife, the mysteries offered a universal democracy of salvation. The initiation rite was the great equalizer. Your wealth could buy you a more comfortable journey to the sanctuary, but it could not buy you a better spot in the Elysian Fields. Your social status might grant you privileges in the assembly, but it gave you no advantage before the goddesses. The only ticket to this paradise was participation in the rites and the maintenance of the sacred oath. This universal appeal created a powerful, cross-cultural bond that helped the mysteries withstand political upheavals, wars, and the rise and fall of empires. The psychological impact of this belief cannot be overstated. To truly appreciate its power, we have to step into the sandals of an ancient Greek. Life in the ancient world was profoundly uncertain. Disease, famine, and violence were constant threats. Infant mortality was high, and life expectancy was short. In such a world, the fear of death was not an abstract philosophical concept. It was a daily, visceral reality. The Eleusinian promise offered a tangible way to manage that existential terror. It replaced the chilling uncertainty of Homer's Hades with a specific, detailed, and beautiful destination. An initiate could face the hardships of life, the loss of loved ones, and even their own mortality with a profound sense of peace. They knew, with a certainty born from their transformative experience in the Telesterion, that death was not a final defeat. It was a passage, a gateway to a blessed state of being. This was the secret that the Hierophant revealed, not a theological dogma, but a visceral, emotional conviction that liberated the initiate from the primal fear of oblivion. The mysteries did not promise immortality of the soul in a philosophical sense. They promised a better, happier, and more tangible existence beyond the grave, and for the people of the ancient world that was a gift beyond price. But this profound revelation, this transformative promise of eternal bliss, came with an absolute and non-negotiable condition, an unbreakable vow of silence. The power of the Eleusinian experience was intrinsically tied to its secrecy. Before any candidate could even set foot in the Telesterion, they were required to stand before the community of initiates and swear a solemn oath, invoking the wrath of the gods themselves, that they would never, under any circumstances, reveal what they were about to see and hear. This was not a gentle promise, it was a binding contract with divine and mortal consequences. The penalty for breaking this oath was severe and unequivocal: death. And this was not an abstract threat. Historical records tell us of individuals who were executed for profaning the mysteries. The most famous case is that of the Athenian aristocrat Alcibiades, who was accused of parodying the rites during a drunken party. Though he avoided immediate execution by fleeing into exile, the charge itself was considered so grave that it contributed to his political downfall and eventual assassination. The message was clear: to reveal the secret was to commit a crime against the state and the gods, a transgression worthy of the ultimate punishment. Why was this veil of secrecy so impenetrable? The reasons were both practical and profoundly psychological. On a practical level, secrecy maintained the exclusivity and therefore the prestige of the mysteries. If anyone could simply hear about the rituals secondhand, the entire elaborate structure of preparation, purification, and pilgrimage would lose its meaning. The difficulty of the journey and the gravity of the oath were filters, ensuring that only those with genuine dedication and reverence could partake. This exclusivity created a powerful in-group bond among the initiates, a sense of being part of a chosen community that possessed a rare and precious truth. This social cohesion was a vital source of the cult's stability and longevity, allowing it to operate as a state-sponsored institution for nearly 2 millennia. But the deeper reason for secrecy lies in the very nature of the experience itself. The mysteries were not designed to convey intellectual information. They were engineered to produce a powerful, personal, emotional, and spiritual transformation. This kind of transformation is fragile. It relies on a specific set and setting: the exhaustion of the journey, the tension of the fast, the collective anticipation, the shock of the darkness, and the climax of the great fire. If the sequence of events were known in advance, if the climax were described in detail, the entire process would be robbed of its power. Knowing what is going to happen allows the analytical mind to engage, to critique, to distance itself. The initiate would become a spectator rather than a participant. The element of surprise, of the unknown, was essential for bypassing the critical faculties and speaking directly to the soul. Secrecy preserved the raw, visceral impact of the revelation. Think of it this way: you cannot describe the beauty of a symphony to someone who has never heard music. You cannot explain the color red to a person blind from birth. The core of the Eleusinian experience was similarly ineffable. It was a state of being, a feeling of absolute certainty and hope that was generated by the entire ritual process. To try to put that feeling into words would inevitably diminish it, reducing a life-altering epiphany to a mere story. The priests of Eleusis understood that the mystery itself was the message. The secrecy was not about hiding a simple object or a specific prayer. It was about protecting the transformative potential of the journey. By forcing initiates to carry the secret in their hearts rather than on their tongues, they ensured that the experience remained a living, personal truth, rather than becoming just another piece of mythology discussed in the marketplace. The silence surrounding Eleusis was not an empty void. It was a sacred space where each individual's personal encounter with the divine could resonate and grow, forever untarnished by the clumsy inadequacy of human language. The vow of silence was, paradoxically, the very thing that allowed the mystery's voice to echo so powerfully through the centuries. The extraordinary prestige of the Eleusinian Mysteries is perhaps most vividly demonstrated by the company it kept. This was not a secret cult lurking on the fringes of society. It was an institution embraced by the most brilliant minds and the most powerful rulers of the ancient world. To be initiated was a mark of sophistication, a sign that one was engaged with the deepest questions of existence. Consider the figure of Socrates. While we have no direct record of his initiation, his pupil Plato provides compelling evidence. In one of his dialogues, Plato has Socrates reference the language of the mysteries, speaking of the final vision in terms that only an initiate would understand. This strongly suggests that Socrates himself had undergone the rites, seeking there, as in the Athenian agora, the ultimate truths about the soul and its fate. His engagement with Eleusis places the mysteries not as a rival to philosophy, but as a complementary path to wisdom, a deeply personal experience that could inform rational inquiry. Plato, Socrates' most famous student, was almost certainly an initiate, and the influence of the mysteries on his thought is profound and undeniable. His entire theory of forms, the idea that the world we perceive is but a poor shadow of a higher, perfect reality, reads like a philosophical translation of the Eleusinian experience. The journey of the soul in his allegory of the cave, escaping the darkness of ignorance to behold the brilliant sun of truth, is a direct parallel to the initiate's path from the blackness of the Telesterion to the shocking revelation of the Great Fire. For Plato, the mysteries offered a tangible, ritualized proof of the philosophical concepts he taught. They provided a lived experience of ascent from a world of appearances to a realm of pure being, reinforcing his conviction that the soul was immortal and that a better existence awaited beyond the grave. When he wrote that the true purpose of philosophy is to practice dying, he was echoing the central promise of Eleusis, that by confronting the idea of death within the safety of the ritual, one could conquer the fear of it in life. This appeal stretched far beyond the borders of Greece, captivating the pragmatic minds of the Roman Republic and Empire. The great orator Cicero, a man known for his sharp legal and political acumen, left us with one of the most eloquent testimonies to the power of the rites. He wrote that the mysteries had taught humanity not only how to live with joy but how to die with better hope. For a Roman statesman like Cicero, whose world was defined by law, order, and public virtue, Eleusis offered something that the official state religion could not: a personal, emotional assurance of salvation. It smoothed the savageness of life by providing a concrete answer to the terror of mortality, an answer he found rationally and spiritually satisfying. His endorsement signals that the mystery's power transcended cultural differences, speaking to a universal human need that even the most disciplined and practical individuals recognized. The ultimate testament to the mystery's authority came when the most powerful men in the world, the Roman emperors, sought initiation. This was not a mere political gesture, it was a profound personal quest. Emperor Hadrian, a deeply intellectual and Hellenophile ruler, was a devoted initiate. He visited Eleusis multiple times and invested heavily in beautifying the sanctuary, seeing it as the spiritual heart of his empire. His successor, Antoninus Pius, continued this patronage, but the most poignant example is the philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius. In the midst of leading brutal military campaigns on the Danube frontier, grappling with plague and managing the immense burdens of empire, he made time to be initiated. It is a striking image. The Stoic emperor, who wrote in his meditations about the fleeting nature of life and the importance of accepting death with equanimity, still felt the need to journey to Eleusis. This tells us that even for a man who had disciplined his mind to face oblivion, the mysteries offered something more than philosophical resignation. They offered a visceral, hopeful experience, a comfort that pure reason could not fully provide. The participation of these emperors underscores a crucial point. The mysteries did not compete with power, they complemented it. They offered a spiritual legitimacy and a personal solace that even an emperor could not find anywhere else. cementing their status as the most revered religious institution of the classical world for centuries. While the mysteries of Eleusis were open to a vast and diverse cross-section of society, Demeter's worship also found powerful expression in rituals that were far more exclusive, creating sacred spaces where the social norms of the ancient world were temporarily upended. One of the most significant of these was the Thesmophoria, a festival celebrated by women for women across the Greek world. For 3 days each autumn, just before the time of sowing, the civic and domestic order was set aside. Married women who were citizens, the wives, mothers, and daughters of the polis, withdrew from their homes and families. They established their own temporary communities, camping out in makeshift shelters on the slopes of the hill sacred to Demeter the Thesmophoros, the lawbringer. This title itself is fascinating, as it suggests the goddess presided not just over the fertility of the soil, but over the social and legal order that the women would soon temporarily suspend. The atmosphere of this festival was one of inversion and potent female solidarity. During these days, the women observed a strict fast, much like the initiates at Eleusis, abstaining from certain luxuries to purify themselves. But more strikingly, they engaged in a form of ritual obscenity and jesting, exchanging insults and jokes that would have been considered completely inappropriate in everyday life. This controlled chaos, known as astrologia or shameful speech, mirrored the jesting at the bridge during the Eleusinian procession. It was believed to have a magical, apotropaic function, warding off evil forces and through laughter and transgression promoting fertility. It also served as a pressure valve, a sanctioned release from the strict behavioral codes that governed their lives, strengthening the bonds between them as they collectively stepped outside conventional boundaries. The central, most secret ritual of the Thesmophoria centered on objects of potent symbolism, piglets and pits. Months before the main festival, during a lesser-known rite called the Skira, a select group of women called Antaltriae or Balers would cast piglets along with specially baked cakes shaped like phalluses and snakes, unmistakable symbols of fertility, into deep, underground chambers called megara. These pits were sacred to Demeter and her daughter, Persephone, and were believed to be direct conduits to the underworld. The piglets and cakes were left there to decay, to commune with the chthonic powers of the earth throughout the spring and summer. When the time for the Thesmophoria arrived, these same women would descend into the megara to retrieve the now decayed remains. This act was not for the faint of heart. The retrieval of these decomposed offerings, which had spent months mingling with the essence of the underworld, was a deeply sacred and dangerous task. The resulting mixture, a composite of decayed flesh and dough, was considered incredibly powerful. The women would then carefully place this substance on the altars of Demeter and Kore. Later, it would be mixed with the season's seed corn before it was sown into the waiting earth. The symbolism here is profound and directly parallel to the myth of Persephone. The piglet, a creature of fertility, is cast down into the dark earth, a symbolic death. It decays just as the seed appears to die in the ground. But this decay is not an end, it is a transformation, a necessary stage in the cycle. By retrieving these remains and mixing them with the seed, the women were performing a powerful act of sympathetic magic. They were transferring the potent, life-generating power of decay and death back into the new seed, ensuring that just as Persephone returns from the underworld and the piglet's sacrifice gives way to new life, the sown grain would burst forth from the soil in an abundant harvest. The women, through their rituals, became the active agents of this cosmic cycle, directly mediating between the realms of death and life to guarantee the community's survival. In a society where their public roles were often limited, the Thesmophoria granted them an essential, respected, and fearsome religious authority, demonstrating that Demeter's power was channeled as potently through the exclusive rites of women as it was through the grand pan-Hellenic spectacle of Eleusis. Yet for all the profound comfort and hope Demeter offered to her faithful initiates, it is crucial to remember that her nature was not one of unconditional, gentle benevolence. The same goddess who presided over the life-giving harvest also wielded the power to revoke that gift, and her wrath, when provoked, was as terrifying and absolute as her blessings were generous. To understand the full spectrum of her power is to appreciate the high stakes involved in her worship, a lesson chillingly illustrated in the myth of a man named Erusichthon. His story serves as a stark warning of the consequences of violating the sacred boundaries of the natural world that Demeter governed. Erusichthon was a nobleman of Thessaly, a man of means and status, but possessed by an arrogance that blinded him to the divine. He decided he needed timber to build a great banqueting hall, a place to entertain his friends with lavish feasts. Instead of sourcing wood from ordinary forests, he set his sights on a grove of towering, ancient trees that was a sacred precinct of Demeter. This was no ordinary wood. It was a place of worship where nymphs danced around the oldest and most revered tree, a gigantic oak draped with votive ribbons and tokens left by pious worshippers. The grove itself hummed with a palpable sacred presence, a fact that Erusichthon, in his hubris, chose to ignore. When his woodcutters, sensing the holiness of the place, refused to raise their axes, Erusichthon snatched a weapon himself. He strode toward the great oak and swung the double-bladed axe into its trunk. The moment the metal bit into the living wood, a deep, agonized groan echoed from the tree, and blood, shockingly red and warm, began to pour from the gash. A horrified bystander tried to stop him, but Erusichthon, in a fury, beheaded the man and continued his assault on the tree, deaf to the warnings and the clear evidence of the divine life he was destroying. He was not merely cutting down a tree, he was committing an act of sacrilege, murdering a sacred being and desecrating the goddess's home. Demeter's response was swift and terrifying. She did not appear to him in a rage. Her punishment was far more sinister and personal. She summoned a minor goddess, Limos, the very embodiment of famine, a pale, withered, and desperate creature whose eyes were hollow with endless want. Demeter ordered Limos to inhabit Erusichthon's body, to curse him with a hunger that could never, ever be satisfied. The punishment was a dark and ironic reflection of his crime. He had violated a space of natural abundance and life. His sentence was to be consumed by an unnatural, insatiable void. The curse took hold immediately. Erusichthon awoke with a hunger that devoured him from the inside out. He ate and ate, consuming enough food for an entire army, yet his body remained gaunt and starving. The more he consumed, the more the hunger grew, a fire in his belly that no feast could extinguish. He sold all his possessions, his land, his inheritance, to buy more food, reducing his family to poverty. When all his wealth was gone, he was reduced to begging on the streets, a shocking fall from grace for a once proud nobleman. But even this was not the end. In his ultimate degradation, his own daughter, a young woman who possessed the magical ability to change her shape, was forced to sell herself into slavery repeatedly, using her powers to escape and return, just so her father could have more money to feed his cursed appetite. The myth concludes with the ultimate horror. After devouring everything he owned and exploiting everyone he loved, Erusichthon's hunger remained. There was nothing left to consume. And so, in a final, gruesome act, the man who had sought to build a hall for feasting began to feast upon himself. He turned his own body into a bloody banquet, tearing at his flesh in a futile attempt to sate the demon of famine within him. His life ended not with a bang, but with a cannibalistic whimper, a horrifying testament to the consequences of defying Demeter's sacred laws. This story was not just a fable, it was a powerful piece of religious propaganda, a chilling reminder that the goddess of the harvest held the power of life and death, and that disrespect for her domain, the natural world and its cycles, could lead to a destruction far more terrible than a simple drought. It underscored a fundamental truth for the ancient Greeks. The line between civilization and nature was sacred, and to cross it was to invite a divine retribution that consumed the transgressor from the inside out. Yet for all its profound power and near-universal reverence, the 2,000-year continuum of the Eleusinian Mysteries could not withstand the tectonic shifts of a changing world. The decline began not with a sudden attack, but with a slow, ideological erosion. As the Roman Empire transformed under Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century, Christianity moved from a persecuted faith to the favored religion of the state. This new worldview was fundamentally incompatible with the old pagan rites. For Christian theologians, the mysteries were not a sacred path to enlightenment. They were demonic deceptions, dangerous superstitions that threatened the souls of the faithful by offering a false salvation that competed with the message of Christ. The very secrecy that had protected the rites for millennia now made them suspect, viewed as a hotbed of idolatry and immorality. The first major legal blow fell in 392 AD, when the fervently Christian Emperor Theodosius I issued a series of sweeping edicts that outlawed all pagan worship throughout the empire. The public sacrifices, the festivals, the visits to temples, all were banned. While some ancient cults might have persisted in secret for a time, the Eleusinian Mysteries were an impossible target for such discretion. Their power was inextricably linked to their public nature. The great pilgrimage from Athens, the state-sponsored priests, the international gathering of initiates. They could not simply go underground. Theodosius's decree effectively pulled the legal and financial foundation out from under the sanctuary. After celebrating the rites for nearly 2 millennia, the cycle was broken. The sacred fire in the Telesterion was extinguished, and the long silence of the sacred way began. But the final, physical end was as violent as its spiritual suppression was systematic. Just a few years later, in 396 AD, a new and terrifying force arrived at the gates of Eleusis, the Visigoth king Alaric. Leading a massive army of Germanic warriors, Alaric was not a skeptic or a religious reformer. He was a conqueror, and for him, the renowned sanctuary represented a wealthy, undefended target. The massive walls that had once symbolized the separation of the sacred from the profane were no match for a determined military assault. The Visigoths swept through the sanctuary, looting its accumulated treasures, centuries of votive offerings made by emperors, philosophers, and countless grateful initiates. What they could not carry, they destroyed. The great Telesterion, the hall that had housed the ancient secret, was desecrated and set ablaze. The stones, blackened by fire, tumbled down, burying the Anactoron and its priceless contents under rubble and ash. The destruction was so complete that when archaeologists excavated the site centuries later, they found a clear layer of burnt debris marking this catastrophic event. The loss is almost impossible to quantify. It was not merely the demolition of a building, it was the annihilation of a living tradition, a direct severing of a spiritual thread that stretched back to the dawn of Western civilization. In a single generation, the rituals that had offered solace to Socrates and Cicero, that had shaped the philosophy of Plato and attracted Roman emperors, were erased. The knowledge of what transpired in the dark of the Telesterion, passed down orally from priest to priest for 2,000 years, died with the last hierophant. The initiates, bound by their oath, took the secret to their graves, and within a few decades there was no one left who remembered the path. The silence that was once sacred became absolute. The whispering of the wheat fields around Eleusis now spoke only of decay and forgetfulness, a haunting testament to the fragility of even the most enduring human traditions when confronted by the unyielding march of history and the sword. But the silencing of the sacred rites at Eleusis did not mean their story was over. Like a deep-rooted plant that has been cut down, the mysteries did not die. Instead, their essence seeped into the soil of Western culture, sending up new shoots in the most unexpected places. The profound themes they embodied: the cycle of death and rebirth, the transformative power of secret knowledge, the archetypal journey of the soul, refused to be confined by the rubble of the Telesterion. They became a hidden current flowing beneath the surface of art, literature, and psychology for centuries, waiting for creators and thinkers to tap into their ancient power. We can see this influence emerge with stunning clarity during the Renaissance, a period obsessed with rediscovering the wisdom of the classical world. While artists openly celebrated the gods of Olympus in their paintings, the deeper, more mystical aspects of Demeter's story found a natural home in a new Christian context. The archetype of the grieving mother searching for a lost child resonated powerfully with the imagery of the Virgin Mary mourning the crucified Christ. But the connection goes even deeper. The very idea of a mystery, of a truth that must be approached through revelation rather than reason, fascinated Renaissance humanists. They began to see the Eleusinian rites not as pagan superstition, but as a precursor to their own philosophical quests, a symbolic system that pointed toward universal truths about the human condition. This reinterpretation allowed the emotional core of the myth to survive, transmuted into the spiritual seeking that characterized the era. It was the Romantic poets of the 19th century, however, who truly embraced the mysteries as a direct source of inspiration. For them, Eleusis represented everything the industrialized, rationalist world had lost: a connection to nature, the primacy of profound emotion, and the validity of transcendent experience. John Keats, in his epic poem Hyperion, explicitly places the fall of the Titans in the shadow of a sacred grove reminiscent of Demeter's domain. His odes are saturated with Eleusinian imagery. The sensation of autumn's mellow fruitfulness is a direct echo of the harvest goddess's bounty, while his preoccupation with the poignant beauty of decay and the yearning for an escape from mortality mirrors the initiate's journey from despair to hope. For Keats and his contemporaries, the mysteries became a symbol of art's highest purpose: to provide a secular epiphany, a glimpse of beauty so intense it functioned as a truth in itself, capable of soothing the soul's fear of oblivion, much like the ancient rites had promised. This fascination found its most systematic exploration in the 20th century through the pioneering work of Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung. Jung saw in the Eleusinian Mysteries a powerful validation of his theories of the collective unconscious and its archetypes. He argued that the story of Demeter and Persephone was not merely a myth, but a primordial expression of universal psychological patterns buried deep within the human psyche. The goddess pair represented the archetype of the mother and the maiden, symbolizing the different stages of a woman's life, but also fundamental aspects of the psyche itself: the nurturing, life-giving principle and the innocent, vulnerable soul that must endure a necessary descent into the unconscious, a kind of psychological underworld, in order to mature and be reborn into a more complete self. Jung interpreted the initiation process at Eleusis as the archetypal pattern of individuation, the lifelong process of integrating the conscious and unconscious parts of the psyche to achieve wholeness. The journey of the Mysti, with its phases of separation from the ordinary world, ordeal through fasting and ritual, and final return with a new understanding, mirrored the psychological journey of confronting one's own shadow and emerging with greater self-awareness. For Jung, the secret of Eleusis was ultimately a secret about the human mind. The vision of the Great Fire was not just a promise of an afterlife, but a symbol of the enlightenment that comes from bravely facing the darkness within. The mysteries, in his view, were a sophisticated ancient technology for guiding individuals through this essential, transformative process, proving that the human need for initiation and renewal is a fundamental, timeless drive. This psychological lens allows us to understand why the whispers of Eleusis continue to haunt us. They speak to a journey we are all compelled to take, not toward the Elysian fields, but toward the center of our own being. Today, if you walk through the modern town of Elefsina, just a short drive from the sprawl of Athens, you can stand on the very ground where these ancient whispers once echoed. The air is different now, scented with industry from nearby factories, but the stones beneath your feet still hold their secrets. The archaeological site of Eleusis is a sprawling, layered puzzle where ruins from 2,000 years of continuous worship sit jumbled together, a testament to the sanctuary's long and complicated history. Walking among these remains is not like visiting the clean, majestic lines of the Parthenon. This is a place that demands imagination, a landscape of foundations and fractured walls where you have to piece together the grandeur in your mind's eye. The most overwhelming feature, even in its ruined state, is the Telesterion itself. You approach it not through a grand entrance, but across its vast, open floor, a sea of stone blocks and column bases that stretches out in a gigantic rectangle. It's difficult to grasp the scale until you're standing in the middle of it, looking up at the surrounding hills and realizing this was once a completely enclosed, windowless space. The most striking feature is the network of deep, geometric trenches cut into the bedrock of the floor. These are the foundations for the tiers of steps that once rose on all four sides, the very bleachers where thousands of initiates stood in the darkness. You can walk up to the far edge and see the unmistakable outline of the Anaktoron, the Holy of Holies. It's a small, rectangular foundation set apart from the rest, a permanent stone platform that held the inner sanctum. To stand before it is a haunting experience. This simple, unadorned patch of stone was the focal point of the entire ancient mystery, the spot from which the Hierophant emerged with the blazing light and the sacred objects. The silence here today feels heavy, a stark contrast to the roaring chants and gasps that once filled this air. Leading away from the Telesterion is the beginning of the sacred way, the processional path from Athens. You can still trace its route through the sanctuary, passing by the remains of other crucial structures. There are the foundations of the temples dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, smaller and more intimate than the Great Hall. You can see the Plutonian, a natural cleft in the rock that was believed to be an entrance to the underworld itself, where Hades emerged to abduct Persephone. This chasm would have been a powerful, tangible link to the myth during the rituals. Nearby are the ruins of the Great Propylaea, or Gateway, a monumental entrance built by the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, mimicking the magnificent entrance to the Acropolis in Athens. This fusion of Greek and Roman architecture shows just how important the site remained for centuries, attracting patronage from the highest levels of power. But what do these stones actually tell us about the secrets they guarded? The truth is they offer tantalizing glimpses, but never the full picture. Archaeological excavations have unearthed thousands of artifacts, yet they are like finding individual words from a lost epic poem. Among the most common finds are small terracotta votive plaques depicting scenes related to the goddesses. Some show Demeter and Persephone side by side, holding torches and sheaves of wheat. Others show a young, male figure, often identified as Triptolemos, the hero Demeter taught to cultivate grain, sitting on a winged chariot, ready to spread the gift of agriculture to the world. These plaques were left by initiates as offerings, a silent thank you for the blessings they received. They confirm the central characters of the myth but give no detail about the nocturnal rituals within the Telesterion. Inscriptions carved into stone blocks provide another layer of evidence. They list the names of priests and priestesses, record decrees honoring benefactors who paid for repairs, and outline the strict rules governing the sanctuary. One famous inscription sternly warns that anyone who enters the sanctuary without being pure will face a bad end, a chilling echo of the consequences for violating the sacred laws. These administrative details paint a vivid picture of the mysteries as a highly organized, state-sponsored institution, but they carefully avoid describing the rituals themselves. The most frustrating finds are the ones that hint at the experience without explaining it. For example, archaeologists have discovered special vessels that were likely used to mix and serve the kykeon, the sacred barley drink. Holding one of these cups, you can't help but wonder about its contents. Was it a simple, symbolic potion, or did it contain something more that opened the doors of perception? The greatest enigma, and the one that fuels the most speculation, is the complete absence of the hierer, the most sacred objects. Despite over a century of meticulous excavation, no cache of artifacts has ever been found that can be definitively identified as the contents of the Anactoron. There is no golden sheaf of wheat, no ancient torch, no ritual pomegranate. This profound absence is in its own way the most powerful evidence for the effectiveness of the Oath of Silence. It suggests that the objects were either so intrinsically ordinary that they are indistinguishable from other finds, or, more likely, that they were so sacred they were carefully hidden or destroyed before the sanctuary finally fell, ensuring they would never be profaned by outsider eyes. The empty foundation of the Anactoron stands as a silent challenge to archaeologists and historians, a reminder that some truths were never meant to be dug up. The stones of Eleusis give us the stage, the set pieces, and the program notes, but the climax of the play, the transformative experience that occurred there, remains locked in the memories of the initiates, forever lost to the material record. This brings us to one of the most compelling and contentious debates surrounding the Eleusinian Mysteries, the question of what, exactly, triggered those life-altering visions within the Telesterion. While the rituals themselves were powerful, could there have been a chemical key that unlocked the doors of perception? This is the heart of the psychedelic hypothesis, a theory that boldly suggests the ancient priests of Eleusis were masters of sacred pharmacology, using a naturally occurring substance to reliably induce a mystical state. The focus of this idea falls squarely on the kykeon, that simple barley and mint drink consumed to break the sacred fast. Scholars like the ethnomycologist R. Gordon Wasson, the chemist Albert Hofmann, the very man who discovered LSD, and the classicist Carl A. P. Ruck proposed a revolutionary idea. The kykeon was a psychoactive brew, and its active ingredient was ergot. Ergot is a fungus, Claviceps purpurea, that naturally infects rye and barley. It appears as dark purple or black growths on the grain heads, often referred to as ergot sclerotia. For most of history, ergot was known as a deadly poison. When consumed in large quantities from contaminated bread, it causes a horrific illness called ergotism or scent. Anthony's fire, characterized by burning sensations, gangrene, convulsions, and death. However, in the precise, controlled context of a ritual, the same fungus could be a gateway to the divine. The ergot sclerotia contain a complex cocktail of alkaloids, including lysergic acidamide or LSA, a chemical cousin of LSD. When prepared correctly, likely by carefully harvesting the ergot, separating it from the grain, and then steeping it in water, it could produce a potent psychedelic potion without the toxic side effects associated with eating the fungus directly. The evidence for this theory is surprisingly robust when you examine the ancient text that describes the kykeon's recipe. It comes from the Homeric hymn to Demeter, our earliest source for the myth. When the goddess, disguised as an old woman, is welcomed into the home of King Celeus in Eleusis, she refuses wine but asks for a specific drink instead, a mixture of barley, water, and pennyroyal mint. This is the kykeon. Proponents of the psychedelic theory point out that this is not a recipe for a nutritious meal after a fast. Barley water is bland, and pennyroyal mint was known in antiquity for its ability to settle the stomach and counteract nausea. This is exactly the kind of ingredient you would add to a concoction, meant to soothe the digestive discomfort that can accompany the ingestion of psychedelic substances. The ritualistic fasting would have further potentiated the effects, as an empty stomach accelerates and intensifies the absorption of psychoactive compounds. If this hypothesis is correct, it provides an elegant and powerful explanation for the consistent, transformative experiences reported across centuries by initiates from vastly different backgrounds. The effects of a drug like LSD align remarkably well with the descriptions of the epopteia. Users report vivid, geometric visual patterns, a profound sense of unity with the cosmos, emotional catharsis ranging from terror to bliss, and a dissolution of the ego that can feel like a symbolic death and rebirth. The initiate, standing in the absolute darkness after a day of fasting and a week of intense emotional and physical preparation, would have been in the perfect set and setting for such an experience. The sacred drama, the sounds, and the final shocking light would have acted as a guide, shaping the drug-induced journey into a coherent narrative based on the myth of Demeter and Persephone. The revelation would not have been a theatrical trick, but an internal, psychological voyage to the brink of death and back, leaving the initiate with an unshakable conviction that they had truly glimpsed the afterlife. In this view, the secret of Eleusis was not a theological secret, but a technological one, the knowledge of how to use a sacred plant medicine to occasion a direct encounter with the divine. However, the psychedelic hypothesis, for all its intrigue, faces significant and legitimate scientific and historical challenges. The primary objection is the danger of ergot. As mentioned, ergot is notoriously toxic. The line between a psychoactive dose and a lethal one is perilously thin. Could the priests have consistently and safely prepared a drink from such a dangerous substance for thousands of people, year after year, without a single recorded incident of mass poisoning? Critics argue this seems highly improbable. They suggest that if the kykeon was psychoactive, it more likely contained a much safer, known entheogen from the Greek world, such as a variety of opium or a hallucinogenic mushroom, though there is no direct textual evidence for this. A more fundamental counter-argument is that the entire experience could be explained by non-pharmacological means. The initiates were psychologically primed to an extraordinary degree. They had endured a long, exhausting pilgrimage, a day of complete fasting leading to hypoglycemia, and hours of sensory deprivation in total darkness. This combination alone can induce powerful altered states of consciousness, including hallucinations, out-of-body experiences, and extreme emotional volatility. The ritual itself was a masterpiece of psychological engineering. The chanting, the rhythmic swinging of the bakoi branches, the terrifying sounds of the sacred drama, all were techniques of trance induction known in many cultures. In this view, the kykeon was exactly what it appeared to be, a symbolic communion meal of Demeter's first gift, barley. Its power was not chemical but symbolic, acting as the final key in a lock that had already been turned by expectation, exhaustion, and expertly crafted ritual. The vision was generated from within the human mind, pushed to its limits by the sacred ordeal. Ultimately, the truth may lie in a synthesis of these perspectives. Perhaps the kykeon did contain a mild psychoactive component, not necessarily from treacherous ergot, but from another, gentler plant that amplified the naturally altered state induced by the rituals. Or perhaps the power of belief and the meticulously controlled environment were so effective that they produced a genuine mystical experience indistinguishable from one triggered by a drug. The enduring legacy of the psychedelic hypothesis is that it forces us to take the initiate's experiences seriously. It challenges the modern bias that such profound states can only be reached through faith or psychology, suggesting instead that the ancient world may have possessed a sophisticated, empirical understanding of the mind's potential, using every tool at its disposal, including sacred chemistry, to guide souls toward transcendence. Whether the key was in the drink or in the drama, the result was the same: a journey to the edge of death and a return filled with the brilliant light of hope. So, what are we to make of this ancient ritual today, in a world lit by electricity and explained by science? The stones of Eleusis may lie in ruins, but the human needs it addressed are as urgent as ever. The genius of the mysteries was their ability to package profound, universal psychological truths within a powerful, multi-sensory experience. At its core, the ritual was a masterful narrative about navigating the most fundamental human fear, the terror of mortality. The initiates didn't just hear a lecture about the afterlife, they lived a metaphor. They physically and emotionally reenacted the descent into darkness, the despair of Demeter, the bleakness of winter, the cold finality of the grave, only to be violently, joyously reunited with the light. This carefully orchestrated journey from despair to hope provided what modern psychology might call a controlled exposure to the concept of death. By safely experiencing symbolic death and rebirth within the sacred container of the ritual, participants could emerge with a genuine, embodied sense of courage, their existential anxiety soothed by the visceral memory of light conquering the dark. This ancient wisdom speaks directly to our modern struggle with meaning in an often fragmented world. The Eleusinian experience was fundamentally about connection to the divine, to the community of fellow initiates, and to the natural world. The myth of Demeter and Persephone is a stark reminder of the unbreakable bond between humanity and the earth. Demeter's grief causes global famine, her joy brings abundance. The ancients understood this interdependence intimately. Their ritual was timed with the agricultural calendar, intertwining the fate of the human soul with the life cycle of the grain. In an age of climate change and environmental disconnection, this aspect of the mysteries feels startlingly relevant. It suggests that psychological well-being is not separate from our relationship with the natural world. The hope for salvation was not an abstract heavenly promise. It was mirrored in the very real annual salvation of the harvest, teaching that caring for the earth is tantamount to caring for our own souls. The ritual fostered a deep, ecological empathy that we are only now, millennia later, struggling to relearn. Furthermore, the emotional heart of the myth, the bond between Demeter and Persephone, resonates with timeless themes of love, loss, and the resilience of connection. This story gives a divine voice to the universal experience of grief and the desperate, enduring power of a mother's love. It validates the pain of separation while simultaneously offering a model for enduring it. The compromise that Persephone must return to the underworld for part of each year is a profound lesson in acceptance. It teaches that loss is not a permanent state, but a phase in a larger cycle, and that love can persist even across the boundary of death. For anyone who has experienced profound loss, the Eleusinian promise is not about avoiding grief, but about finding a way to integrate it into a continuing narrative of hope. The message is that from the deepest despair, a new form of connection, however bittersweet, can be forged. Ultimately, the enduring power of the Eleusinian Mysteries lies in their offer of a hopeful pattern for existence. In a universe that can often feel random and indifferent, the ritual imposed a beautiful, reassuring order. It said that life is not a linear march toward oblivion, but a cyclical journey of transformation. The seed must die in the earth to become the stalk of wheat. The soul must descend into the unknown to be reborn into understanding. This is a narrative that continues to comfort us, whether we find it in religious faith, in the creative process, in the healing journey of therapy, or in the simple observance of the seasons. The whispers of Demeter remind us that the human quest for meaning, for a way to face the darkness with courage, is ageless. While we may no longer journey to a sealed hall in Eleusis, we still seek our own rituals, our own moments of epiphany that assure us that even in the depths of winter, the seeds of spring are waiting, holding the promise of return. And so we are left standing at the edge of a great silence. For all our careful reconstruction, for all the historical fragments and archaeological clues we have pieced together, the very heart of the Eleusinian Mysteries remains shrouded in an impenetrable veil. We can trace the sacred way, we can stand in the ruins of the Telesterion, and we can understand the psychological and cultural forces that drew thousands to this place. But the core of the experience, the moment of ultimate revelation, is a secret that died with the last initiate. This forces us to confront the most tantalizing and perhaps unanswerable questions, the unsolved puzzles that keep the mystery alive even today. The greatest of these enigmas is without doubt the precise nature of the epopteia, the final seeing that was the culmination of the entire arduous journey. We have reasoned that it involved a dramatic unveiling of sacred objects in a burst of blinding light. an experience so profound it erased the fear of death. But what exactly did the initiates see? Was it a single, powerful symbol like a stalk of wheat, or a collection of relics tied to the myth? The theories are compelling, but they remain educated guesses. The true content of that vision was so powerful that it bound people to an oath of silence for life, and its emotional impact was consistently described as ineffable. This suggests that the revelation was not merely a visual spectacle, but a holistic, soul-shattering event that integrated sight, sound, and overwhelming emotion into a single, undeniable truth. The mystery is not just what was in the basket, but how its presentation transformed the viewer's entire perception of reality in an instant. Equally lost to us are the precise words spoken by the Hierophant at that climactic moment. His title means the one who shows the holy, but he was also the one who spoke the holy. What proclamation did he shout into the stunned silence of the Telesterion after the gong's roar and the eruption of light? Was it a simple, triumphant declaration like, "Rejoice, Mistai. The god is saved," affirming the cycle of life, or was it the more cryptic statement about the goddess Brimo giving birth, pointing to a divine birth symbolizing new life emerging from the realm of death? The specific words would have acted as a verbal key, locking the visual and emotional experience into a specific, transformative meaning. The tone, the rhythm, the authority of that single sentence, was it a roar of victory or a hushed, awe-filled statement of fact? This detail is crucial, for in ancient rituals, spoken words were believed to have creative power. The Hierophant's utterance may have been the final ingredient that crystallized the vision into a lifelong conviction for every person in that hall. These are not minor gaps in a historical record. They are the very essence of the ritual, and their absence is a haunting reminder of the limits of our knowledge. We can analyze the set and setting, we can debate the potential pharmacology of the Kaikion, but we cannot recreate the lived experience of a first-century initiate. The secret was not a piece of information that could be written down. It was a state of being, a feeling of certainty that was generated through a complex interplay of expectation, ritual, and revelation. This is why the oath of silence was so effective. You cannot communicate a transformed consciousness through language alone. Every attempt to describe it would inevitably fall short, reducing a cosmic epiphany to a mere story. The initiates understood this, which is why they chose to carry the secret within them rather than betray its profundity with inadequate words. And so, the whispers of Demeter have faded, not into answers, but into a deeper, more resonant mystery. The silence that now envelops Eleusis is not an empty void, but a sacred space in its own right. It is a silence that challenges us to acknowledge that some human experiences are so profound they defy historical excavation. They belong to the moment, to the community that shared them, and to the individuals whose lives were permanently altered. This enduring enigma is paradoxically what keeps the mysteries relevant. It allows them to live on not as a closed chapter in a history book, but as an open question, a symbol of humanity's eternal quest to find light in the darkness and meaning in the great cycle of life and death. The stones may have been scattered, but the questions they provoke continue to echo, inviting each new generation to listen closely and wonder what truths might still be waiting just beyond the edge of hearing. But the profound yearning to understand the cycles of life and death, and to personify the forces of the earth that sustain us, was never unique to the shores of ancient Greece. Demeter's story, with its potent themes of a mother's fierce love, devastating grief, and the hard-won promise of renewal, finds powerful echoes in mythologies across the globe. When we look at other great agricultural civilizations, we see a recurring pattern: a powerful feminine deity who embodies the grain itself, whose emotional state dictates the fertility of the land, and whose story provides a divine blueprint for the relentless turning of the seasons. This isn't mere coincidence, it speaks to a universal human experience, a shared attempt to make sense of our dependence on a capricious yet life-giving natural world. Consider the story of Isis, one of the most revered goddesses of ancient Egypt. While she is often seen as a magical protector and the ideal wife and mother, her narrative contains striking parallels to the Eleusinian myth. Isis's husband, the god Osiris, is murdered and dismembered by his jealous brother Set. Overwhelmed by grief, Isis embarks on a long and desperate search to gather the scattered pieces of his body. Through her powerful magic and unwavering devotion, she temporarily reassembles him and conceives a son, Horus. While Osiris cannot fully return to the land of the living, he becomes the lord and judge of the dead, ruling over a blessed afterlife. The parallels are profound. Like Demeter, Isis is a goddess defined by her grief and her relentless search for a lost loved one. Her actions do not restore Osiris to his former life, but they do transform death from a final end into a transitional state, establishing a cycle where life emerges from death, much like the Egyptian understanding of the Nile's annual flood bringing fertility to the desert. The rituals of Osiris involved the sowing of barley in mummy-shaped pots, a clear symbolic link between the death and resurrection of the god and the growth of the crops, a concept very close to the heart of the Demeter-Persephone cycle. Moving to the even older civilizations of Mesopotamia, we encounter the formidable figure of Inanna, who the Akkadians called Ishtar. Her story, The Descent of Inanna, recorded on clay tablets millennia before the Homeric hymn to Demeter, presents a darker, more politically complex but thematically similar journey. Inanna, the Queen of Heaven, boldly decides to descend into the underworld, the domain of her stern sister, Ereshkigal. She passes through 7 gates, at each one being stripped of her symbols of power, her crown, her jewelry, her robes, until she stands naked and vulnerable before her sister, who immediately kills her and hangs her corpse on a hook. With Inanna trapped in the land of the dead, all fertility ceases on earth, the animals no longer mate and the plants wither. This mirrors the famine caused by Demeter's mourning perfectly. Inanna is only able to return to the upper world through a clever trick, but her resurrection comes with a terrible price. She must provide a substitute to take her place in the underworld. The themes are unmistakable. A powerful goddess ventures into the realm of death, causing life on earth to stall, and her return is conditional, establishing a cyclical pattern of absence and presence that governs the natural world. Across the Atlantic, in the myths of many Native American agricultural societies, we find the archetype of the Corn Mother. While the specific stories vary among tribes like the Cherokee, the Penobscot, and the Hopi, the corn narrative is consistently powerful. In one widespread version, a woman, often seen as a divine being, provides corn for her people through a miraculous act. In some tellings, she is killed, whether by accident or through sacrifice, and from her body, corn springs forth. In others, she drags her body across the earth, and wherever she goes, the first corn plants grow. The Penobscot story tells of First Mother, who, seeing her children starving, instructs them to kill her and drag her body across a cleared field. After 7 months of mourning, they return to find the field abundant with corn, a gift born from her self-sacrifice. This narrative, while more directly focused on the origin of agriculture than on an annual cycle, shares the core Eleusinian idea that life, in the form of nourishing grain, emerges directly from death and sacrifice. The Corn Mother's story is a profound acknowledgement that our sustenance comes from the very body of the earth, a concept deeply embedded in Demeter's identity as the grain-giving goddess. What these global parallels reveal is a profound and universal human preoccupation. From the banks of the Nile to the floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates to the fertile soils of North America, agricultural societies independently developed myths centered on a powerful female deity whose personal drama of loss and partial return explains the most vital and terrifying reality of their existence, the fact that life depends on death. The earth must lie fallow, the seed must be buried and seem to rot, the rains must stop, and the sun must weaken before the miracle of rebirth can occur. These goddesses, Demeter, Isis, Inanna, the Corn Mother, became the divine vessels for this terrifying, beautiful truth. They gave a face to the forces of nature, making them understandable and, more importantly, approachable through prayer and ritual. By worshipping a goddess who grieves like a human mother, ancient peoples could appeal to her emotions, seeking to soothe her sorrow and encourage her generosity. They created rituals not just to honor these deities, but to actively participate in the cosmic cycle, to ensure through sympathetic magic that the goddess would return, the rains would fall, and the grain would rise once more. This shared mythological heritage shows us that the secret of Eleusis, while unique in its elaborate form, was part of a much larger human conversation about our place in a world of constant, necessary change. Our journey through the whispering groves and shadowed halls of Eleusis brings us full circle, back to that faint rustle of wheat on the edge of hearing. We began with the thunderous grief of a mother, a loss so profound it plunged the world into its first winter, and we traced the path of thousands who sought to understand that sorrow for themselves. We walked the sacred way with them, felt the chill of the purifying sea, and stood in that collective, breathless anticipation within the windowless Telesterion. We've explored the potent symbols, from the sheaf of wheat to the torches of a desperate search, and grappled with the tantalizing theories of what truly transpired in that climactic burst of light and revelation. This was not merely a historical curiosity, it was a 2,000-year-long conversation with the most fundamental questions of existence. The enduring power of the Eleusinian Mysteries lay in their ability to provide three profound gifts to the ancient world. The first was comfort, a tangible, emotional antidote to the primal fear of death. In an era of short, uncertain lives, the ritual offered not a philosophical argument, but a visceral experience of rebirth. It replaced the bleak shadows of Homer's Hades with the brilliant, hopeful light of the Elysian fields, granting initiates a certainty that transformed how they lived and how they faced their end. The second gift was community. On the road to Eleusis, social hierarchies dissolved. The emperor, the philosopher, and the farmer walked together as equals, bound by a shared oath and a common purpose. In a world often divided by strife, the mysteries created a powerful, cross-cultural bond centered on a hope that was available to all who sought it with a pure heart. And finally, these rituals offered a profound connection to the cycles of nature. The story of Demeter and Persephone was not just a myth, it was a divine mirror of the agricultural reality that sustained them. It taught that decay is necessary for growth, that darkness precedes the dawn, and that humanity is an intimate part of this eternal, turning wheel. The stones of Eleusis may now lie silent, but the whispers of its secrets continue to challenge and inspire us. They ask us to consider how we, in our modern world, find meaning in the face of mortality. How do we build communities that transcend our differences? And how do we restore our fractured connection to the natural world that Demeter so powerfully embodied? The mystery may be lost, but the human needs it addressed are timeless. So we turn the question over to you. If you could peer through the keyhole of history and unravel one ancient secret, to witness a ritual or understand a lost truth, what would it be? Would you walk the sacred way to Eleusis, stand in the stones of Stonehenge, or seek the wisdom of a library long turned to ash? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear which mystery calls to you. If this journey into the past resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more explorations into the hidden corners of history. Until next time, keep listening. You never know what whispers from the past might still be carried on the wind.